So I want you to picture a high school biology class.
Okay, I'm there.
It is third period. The fluorescent lights are doing that annoying humming thing.
Yeah.
And there is a 16-year-old kid. We're just going to call him Bob.
Right, classic Bob.
Exactly. And Bob is staring intently at the back of the head of the girl sitting directly in front of him. Let's call her Jane.
Okay, Bob and Jane.
Yeah.
Setting the scene.
Yeah. And for Bob, this is not just some, passing adolescent phase. He is entirely, all-consumingly in love with this girl.
Oh, wow. The intense teenage kind.
Exactly. In his mind, the whole narrative is already written. She is the one. But Bob's grand romantic narrative has slammed into a rather formidable brick wall.
Now, let me guess. That wall has a name.
That wall has a name. Jane has a boyfriend named John.
Ah, John.
Yeah. And John isn't just some guy fading into the background of the high school ecosystem. He is the captain of the varsity soccer team.
Of course he is.
Right. He represents the absolute apex of the adolescent social hierarchy.
I mean, that right there is the quintessential crucible for romantic panic. You have this intense desire, completely constrained by an insurmountable social obstacle.
It really is, but the research we are unpacking today points out a really fascinating structural anomaly in Bob's misery.
Okay, what do you mean by anomaly?
Well, at all accounts, Bob should be consumed by this toxic, volcanic resentment toward John, right? He should hate the guy.
Yeah, that would be the assumption.
Yet his envy is remarkably tempered. It never, boils over into a malicious meltdown. And the researchers attribute this to two very specific cognitive breaks.
Which are?
First, Bob suffers from a profound sense of his own unworthiness. He actually tried out for the soccer team and failed spectacularly.
Oh, brutal.
Yeah. So he looks at John and genuinely concludes that John is, the rightful victor in this social Darwinist arena.
Right, he accepts his defeat.
Exactly. And second, there is the undeniable, agonizing reality that Jane barely even knows Bob exists.
So the love is entirely unrequited. And from a psychological standpoint, that unrequited nature, combined with the perceived social deficit, it creates a highly stable, albeit incredibly painful equilibrium.
Yeah, stable is a good word for it.
Right. Bob feels like he is living inside this tragic poem. But if we strip away the poetry, what we're actually observing is a rigid set of cognitive mechanics firing in a very, very predictable sequence.
Which perfectly brings us to the mission for this deep dive. Because we have a dense, layered research report in front of us today.
We really do.
It details something called the augmented duplex theory of love. And this includes 4 empirical studies conducted at Cornell University.
Right, by researchers Robert J. Sternberg, Navjot Kaur, and Elizabeth J. Mister.
Yes, exactly. So today, we are going to decode the hidden architecture of romantic jealousy and envy. We're going to look at the psychological stories we subconsciously draft for our relationships.
I love the stories part. It's so revealing.
It's wild, and ultimately we are going to expose a massive structural blind spot, an illusion of ego that completely warps how every single one of you listening evaluates your own romantic panic.
But to do that, we really have to entirely abandon the romanticized view of these emotions.
Right. We have to look past the poetry.
Exactly. We cannot look at jealousy and envy as these, mystical, chaotic forces of nature that just sort of happen to us.
Like getting struck by lightning.
Right. We have to analyze the emotional geometry of the situations that trigger them.
Uh-huh.
We have to look at the specific points of contact, the vectors of threat, and the internal algorithms we use to process them.
Okay, well, let's establish that geometry right now, because I think we run into a semantic problem right out of the gate with this topic.
We definitely do.
In everyday conversation, people use jealousy and envy as if they're the exact same word.
Oh, all the time. Constantly.
Someone might scroll through social media, see a picture of an acquaintance vacationing in the Maldives and say, oh man, I'm so jealous.
Right. But psychologically speaking, and drawing on the foundational work of researchers like Parrott and Smith, that usage is entirely incorrect.
Completely wrong.
These are distinct emotional experiences. They operate on completely different structural frameworks.
They're entirely different cognitive shapes. Both emotions operate within a triangular relationship dynamic, but the nature of the points on those triangles and the direction of the emotional energy are fundamentally opposed.
Okay, let's map out the first triangle.
Jealousy.
Let's do it. So, jealousy is fundamentally rooted in retention.
Right. Keeping what's yours.
Exactly. It is the defensive posture of keeping what you believe is already yours, but which is currently under threat. So the 3 points of the jealousy triangle are the individual, the romantic partner you're currently attached to, and the rival.
And the rival represents an active external threat, like they are attempting to sever your existing bond and claim the partner for themselves.
Precisely. And the emotional cocktail that results from that specific configuration, it's characterized by a really volatile mix of hurt, anger, and a very specific fear.
The fear of loss.
Yes.
Yes.
You are terrified of having something ripped away from your emotional portfolio.
Right. Okay, so contrast that with the second triangle, which is envy.
Envy is not about retention at all.
Not at all. It is entirely about acquisition. It is the desire to obtain something you do not currently possess.
So the 3 points of the envy triangle shift slightly.
Right. You have the individual, the potential romantic partner, so someone you desire but have absolutely no established claim to, and the rival.
And the rival typically already occupies the space beside that potential partner.
Exactly. So our high schoolers, Bob, Jane, and John, form a classic envy triangle. Bob wants Jane, but John already holds the position.
Right. And the emotional cocktail here, it shares the hurt and the anger, but the fear mechanism is totally different.
Yeah, but Bud isn't terrified of losing Jane because she was never his to lose.
His fear is existential. It's the dread that he will never acquire her.
Man, that's bleak. But the psychological literature adds a necessary layer of nuance to envy, right? Like it subdivides it into benign and malicious forms.
Yes, and this distinction is crucial. So benign envy operates as a motivational catalyst.
Like you see someone with the relationship or the status you desire, and it triggers a drive for self-improvement.
Exactly. You internalize the deficit and attempt to elevate yourself to match the rival's standing.
Okay, but malicious envy, that turns the energy outward.
Right. The motivation becomes destructive. Instead of elevating yourself, the goal becomes actively sabotaging and tearing down the rival to eliminate their advantage.
Which naturally leads us to the hostility hypothesis. This was proposed by Smith and colleagues back in 1994, right?
Yeah, they wanted to understand why that malicious envy is so often accompanied by this deep, corrosive bitterness toward the rival.
And what did they find?
Well, they analyzed all these autobiographical accounts of envy, and the core finding was that hostility doesn't just spontaneously generate. It requires a catalyst of subjective unfairness.
Subjective unfairness. So the envious individual evaluates the rival's advantage and cognitively frames it as an injustice.
Exactly. The internal monologue becomes, they do not deserve that person. I am inherently more deserving.
Wow. So it is this manufactured sense of injustice that rationalizes the hostility.
Yes. And returning to our 16-year-old Bob, he lacked this hostility.
Right. Because he had internalized his own failure to make the soccer team, he genuinely believed John was the rightful victor.
The subjective belief of unfairness was totally absent, so the envy remained untethered to malice.
Okay, I'm picturing this geometrically in my head, and I feel like we need an architectural metaphor to really lock this in.
I love a good metaphor. Let's hear it.
All right, so if I am standing on the battlements of my own castle, pulling up the drawbridge, and actively pouring boiling oil over the walls because an invading army is trying to breach my gates, that is jealousy.
Okay.
But if I am outside, shivering in the mud, staring up at someone else's fortified, well-lit castle, and I am actively plotting a siege because I want to forcibly evict them and take up residence, that is envy.
That is a fantastic analogy. The directional flow of the threat maps perfectly to the psychology.
Right. Inside looking out versus outside looking in.
Exactly. In jealousy, the threat is an invading force attempting to penetrate your established domain. In envy, the threat is an occupying force standing between you and the domain you wish to conquer.
Okay, so we have the structural shapes. We know the difference between guarding the castle and storming it. But this raises a much deeper biological question for me.
Which is?
Why are these specific emotional geometries wired into our neurochemistry so aggressively? Like, why does a perceived threat to our romantic equilibrium trigger a physiological response that feels akin to a near-death experience?
It really does feel like survival's on the line.
Right. The source material suggests we have to dig through our evolutionary baggage and our childhood attachment blueprints before we can understand the modern software running these responses.
Because the hardware dictates the parameters of the software. And that hardware was forged in the ancestral environment.
So let's talk about that ancestral hardware. We all know the classic evolutionary model of jealousy, championed by David Buss.
Right, the premise that jealousy is not a character flaw, but a highly specific adaptive alarm system designed to preserve reproductive success.
But the traditional narrative there has always drawn a really hard line between the sexes, based on their distinct adaptive challenges, hasn't it?
It has. The historical hypothesis posits that men are hypervigilant toward sexual infidelity, while women are hypervigilant toward emotional infidelity.
And the underlying logic is purely biological.
Purely. The male faces the evolutionary nightmare of paternity uncertainty. Prior to modern genetics, a sexually unfaithful mate presented the catastrophic risk of a man diverting his finite lifelong resources into raising a genetic competitor's offspring.
Which is an evolutionary dead end. While for women, the biological reality of childbirth eliminates maternity uncertainty entirely. You know if the kid is yours.
Exactly. So the ancestral threat for females was the loss of the male's resources and physical protection, which were just paramount for infant survival.
So if a mate formed a deep emotional bond with a rival female, the risk was the redirection of those life-saving resources away from her and her children.
Right. And that framework has dominated evolutionary psychology for decades.
However,
Yeah.
and this is a big however, the source material we're examining today introduces a significant methodological complication to that settled science.
Yes, and this is where the research gets incredibly nuanced.
Because the text notes that when researchers moved away from traditional questioning and utilized forced choice continuous scale measures, that gender binary actually began to collapse.
The methodology matters immensely here.
Yeah.
Older studies often forced participants into a rigid artificial binary. Like they would ask, which is worse, sexual or emotional betrayal?
You had to pick one.
Right. But when researchers allowed participants to rate the severity of both on a continuous spectrum, a totally different picture emerged.
And what did the data show?
The data indicated that both men and women actually exhibit a higher baseline predisposition toward jealousy over sexual infidelity than emotional infidelity.
Okay, I have to admit I'm struggling to reconcile that with the resource loss model for women. Like, why would sexual infidelity trigger a higher alarm than emotional infidelity if the evolutionary goal was securing resources?
It's a great question. The leading counterargument in the field is that in the ancestral environment, sexual infidelity was rarely a compartmentalized event.
Meaning what, exactly?
Meaning it wasn't just a physical act in a vacuum. It was a leading indicator of an impending collapse of the pair bond altogether.
Ah.
For both genders, sexual betrayal structurally destabilizes the alliance.
So if the alliance crumbles, the resources disappear anyway.
Exactly. Now, the debate in the field is still incredibly active, but the overarching consensus remains undeniable. The capacity for jealousy is an ancient, hardwired survival mechanism, even if the precise triggers are more symmetrically distributed than Buss originally theorized.
Okay, so that covers the deep ancestral hardware. But we also have a secondary layer of hardware installed much closer to home, right?
Sure.
Shaped during our infancy.
Yes, attachment theory.
Hazan and Shaver's application of attachment theory to adult romance fundamentally altered how we view relationship dynamics.
It really did. The core thesis is that the internal working models we develop, based on the consistency and responsiveness of our primary caregivers, form the blueprint for how we navigate romantic attachment.
So if a caregiver was erratic or dismissive, a child might develop an anxious attachment style.
Right, and in adulthood, that translates to a hypersensitive emotional radar.
They are constantly scanning the horizon for rivals, perceiving threats where none exist because their baseline assumption is that the bond is fragile and abandonment is imminent.
Exactly. But the source material zeroes in on a fascinating paradox regarding the securely attached demographic.
This part blew my mind. Because the intuitive assumption is that securely attached individuals, those with a solid foundation of trust, high self-worth, confidence in their partner, you'd think they would be largely immune to the ravages of jealousy.
You would think so. But the research points to a much more complex reality, specifically citing the two-stage model of attachment and threat developed by Harris and Darby.
The mechanics of this two-stage model are crucial. Let's walk through them. Stage 1 is appraisal.
This is the scanning phase.
Right. And securely attached people possess a remarkably high threshold for threat detection.
Very high. If their partner is engaging in friendly banter with an attractive colleague, the secure individual's internal alarm remains totally silent.
They lean on their established trust, so it requires a massive amount of contradictory evidence for an interloper to even register as a blip on their radar.
But the paradox emerges in stage 2, which is the reaction phase.
Right, once that high threshold is finally breached. Once a threat is empirically confirmed as a genuine, undeniable danger to the relationship structure, how does the secure individual process that data?
Well, the source outlines two competing hypotheses. The secure, low-reactive hypothesis assumes they maintain their emotional equilibrium because their self-worth isn't tethered to the relationship.
Which sounds reasonable.
It does.
Yeah.
But the evidence leans heavily toward the secure, high-reactive hypothesis, which completely upends the conventional wisdom.
Totally upends it, because it suggests that once a legitimate threat bypasses the appraisal filter, securely attached people might actually unleash more jealous anger than their insecure counterparts.
And if you think about it, the logic behind this high reactivity is entirely sound.
Really? How so?
Because they are secure, they place an immense premium on the attachment relationship. They recognize its profound value.
Yeah.
Therefore, they deploy jealousy not as an expression of insecurity or weakness, but as a formidable, aggressive emotional weapon to defend a highly prized asset.
Man, that reframes it entirely. It's an aggressive defense mechanism, not a symptom of fragility.
Precisely.
And this maps perfectly onto another concept mentioned in the text, which is the domain relevance hypothesis.
Oh, this is a great concept. This hypothesis dictates the specific coordinates of who is capable of triggering our alarm systems.
Right. The theory argues that a rival only registers as an existential threat if they outperform you in a domain that is foundational to your own self-concept.
Exactly. So if your entire identity is built around being the intellectual heavyweight in your social circle,
Right, and your partner begins seeking the counsel of a brilliant, charismatic academic, your jealousy will detonate.
But if your partner suddenly spends time with an Olympic athlete and you place zero personal value on athletic prowess, the threat doesn't compute.
You just don't care. Let's return to the castle metaphor, but maybe modernize it into a home security system.
Okay, let's follow that logic.
So, the anxious attachment style is a security system with the sensitivity dialed up so high that a stray cat walking across the driveway triggers a 5-alarm response.
Right, exhausting.
The secure attachment style is a system that only activates when a window is physically shattered.
They wait for the real breach.
Exactly. But the domain relevance hypothesis explains what the burglar is actually targeting once they get inside.
Yes.
If they break in and steal the lawnmower, you are irritated, obviously, but you'll recover. But if they breach the secure perimeter and make a beeline for the single, irreplaceable heirloom that defines your family's legacy, the alarm doesn't just ring, it deafens.
The calibration of the alarm is dictated by the value of the target. I love that.
Yeah.
And we have to layer one more cognitive filter over this, which is attribution theory.
Okay, break that down for us.
Well, researchers like Bauerl, Amerkan, and Hupka demonstrated that the alarm doesn't simply react to the presence of a threat. It reacts to a complex calculus of causality and intent.
So we don't just ask what is happening, we interrogate why it is happening.
Precisely. When a jealousy-inducing event occurs, we immediately subject our partner's behavior to 3 questions. Did my partner cause this situation?
Yeah.
Did they have control over the variables? And crucially, did they intend to induce this feeling of jealousy?
So let's say we are at a restaurant and a highly attractive server overtly flirts with my partner.
Yeah.
And my partner immediately and politely de-escalates the interaction. The system registers a threat, technically, but it doesn't trigger rage toward my partner.
Because they didn't cause the server's attraction, they couldn't control the server's actions, and they clearly lacked malicious intent.
Right. But alter the variables. If your partner initiates the flirting, maintains eye contact, and deliberately escalates the banter while checking to see if you were watching.
The attribution calculus shifts entirely.
It's a completely different equation. They caused it, they controlled it, and the intent was specifically designed to destabilize you.
That attribution of malicious intent is the catalyst that transmutes situational discomfort into a full-blown relationship crisis.
Okay, so this brings us to a major transition point in our deep dive. We have mapped the evolutionary hardware, we have outlined the infant attachment wiring, the domain relevance, and the attribution filters.
We've built the machine.
We have, but hardware is inert without software. And this brings us to the centerpiece of the research, Robert Sternberg's augmented duplex theory of love.
The software running the machine.
Exactly. What is the cognitive software actually running our romantic lives?
Sternberg's model attempts to bridge the gap between biological drives and cognitive narratives. He proposed that love is a duplex structure. It operates on 2 distinct but interacting levels.
Okay, the first level is his renowned triangular theory of love. This represents the internal, phenomenological experience of love, and he breaks it down into 3 constituent elements.
Right. Intimacy, passion, and commitment.
First, intimacy. That's the architecture of trust, emotional closeness, and vulnerable communication. Second, passion. The raw physiological drive, the intense longing and physical need. And third, commitment. The cognitive decision to maintain the bond over a sustained temporal arc.
And every relationship features a unique ratio of those three elements. And a threat to the relationship will trigger a specific flavor of jealousy depending on which element is most dominant.
So if your bond is heavily weighted toward intimacy, a rival threatens your safe harbor of trust.
Exactly. If passion dominates, the rival threatens your physiological supply.
But Sternberg realized that this internal triangle, while accurate, was basically insufficient to explain the sheer chaotic variance in how people experience romantic panic.
Right, the internal feelings didn't fully account for the behavioral output he was seeing.
So he introduced the second level of the duplex, love as a story. This is the narrative software.
And this theory posits that from early childhood, through a constant osmosis of cultural media, literature, observing adult dynamics, we subconsciously draft elaborate mental scripts dictating exactly how a romantic relationship is supposed to function.
We aren't just participants, we are the screenwriters of our own romantic narrative.
We really are.
And the source material catalogs 25 specific genres of these internal love stories. Reviewing this list is genuinely unsettling, because you immediately recognize these toxic architectures in people you know.
Oh, you see it everywhere once you know what to look for.
Yeah.
Let's dissect a few of the more prominent ones, starting with the police story.
Okay, let's hear the police story.
So, in a relationship governed by the police story, the internal script demands constant surveillance. The partner is not viewed as a trusted equal, but rather as a suspect out on parole.
Oh, wow.
The individual assumes the role of the investigator, constantly monitoring communications, interrogating motives, looking for infractions. In this narrative, jealousy isn't an anomaly. It is the core mechanic of the relationship. It is literally the job description.
It sounds structurally exhausting. Just exhausting.
Very.
Contrast that with the horror story, which operates on a much darker psychological imperative.
Yes. The horror story script dictates that peace is synonymous with apathy.
If things are quiet, it means they don't care.
Exactly. For love to feel authentic to this individual, it must be laced with terror. They must either be terrorizing their partner or being terrorized by them.
So the introduction of a rival
Is often a manufactured event. It's a tool used deliberately to inject fear into a stagnant dynamic. They leverage jealousy to synthesize passion out of panic.
that is so toxic. Then there is the business story. Here, the romance is stripped of its poetry entirely and replaced with a transactional ledger. Partners are viewed as business associates, and the relationship is a negotiated contract.
Right. So when a rival appears in a business story, the emotional response is framed as outrage over a breach of contract.
Like a corporate betrayal.
Exactly. The jealousy is processed as a reaction to a hostile takeover attempt or a fraudulent negotiation. The emotional pain is real, but the cognitive framework is entirely transactional.
And the history story, this one fascinated me. The individual views the relationship primarily as the accumulation of an indelible historical record. They are essentially curators of a shared past.
Which makes a rival incredibly threatening.
Right, a rival is terrifying not just because they might steal the partner in the present, but because they threaten to rewrite the future history. They threaten to sever the timeline and render the curated past irrelevant.
And the list is extensive. You have the art story, where the partner is commodified into a prized aesthetic object meant to reflect the owner's status.
Like a trophy.
Yes. You have the gardening story, which casts the relationship as an incredibly fragile organism requiring constant, anxious cultivation to protect it from invasive weeds. The weeds, of course, being potential rivals.
Let's weave our earlier metaphor back into this. If we are all walking around with these rigid, pre-written movie scripts in our heads, what happens when two people cast themselves in the same relationship but are reading for entirely different genres?
It basically guarantees a structural collapse.
Right. So if my internal narrative is a cookbook story, the text mentions this one, where the belief is that if I simply follow a specific set of behavioral recipes, relationship success is mathematically guaranteed.
Okay.
I am playing my part perfectly. But suddenly, my partner, whose internal narrative is actually a horror story, starts ad-libbing.
Oh, no.
They start purposefully seeking out a third party to inject terror into the dynamic. My resulting jealousy isn't just a fear of loss. It is a profound, disorienting creative panic. My entire script is disintegrating in real time.
And that phenomenon is exactly why Sternberg utilizes the term augmented duplex theory.
Augmented.
Right. The internal feelings of the triangle and the internal scripts of the narrative are potent, but they remain latent until they are augmented by an external variable.
You require the situational threat. The rival walking onto your carefully constructed movie set and ignoring the script to catalyze the full psychological breakdown, which transitions us beautifully from the theoretical framework into the empirical data. Because theory is great, but how does this theoretical duplex actually hold up under the scrutiny of the scientific method?
Right. And this was the core objective of the 4 studies conducted at Cornell University. The researchers aimed to construct a mathematical model.
They wanted to determine if they could statistically predict the intensity of a subject's jealousy or envy based on a specific set of internal variables and external threats.
Exactly. So let's deconstruct study 1, which focused on the mechanics of jealousy through the lens of hypothetical observation.
So they recruited 219 undergraduate students and presented them with intricately plotted vignettes featuring 2 characters, Chad and Victoria.
And these vignettes were designed to systematically manipulate the variables of the augmented duplex theory. For example, a baseline scenario establishes Chad and Victoria as high school sweethearts who relocate to Chicago.
Okay.
Victoria secures an internship as a makeup artist. Chad pursues a degree in data science. The narrative introduces a drift in intimacy. Chad becomes hyper-focused on his career, and Victoria begins attending social events with a colleague named Anthony.
Anthony is the rival.
Yes, and the climax of the vignette occurs when Victoria requests an open marriage.
Wow. It's a highly engineered stress test for a relationship.
Precisely. And the researchers generated 16 distinct permutations of this core narrative, strategically altering whether Chad's internal feelings were high or low, and whether Anthony's external threat level was high or low.
So the participants read these stories and were then asked to evaluate a series of specific metrics. First, the internal variables, like how much does Chad want Victoria? How intensely does he need her? What is his level of care for her? Does he believe he deserves her? Is the continuation of their relationship still plausible?
Right.
And then they evaluated the critical external variable. How significant of a threat does Anthony pose to the union?
Finally, the participants were asked the ultimate diagnostic question. Based on your evaluation of those variables, what is Chad's level of jealousy?
And to analyze this data, the researchers utilized a statistical technique called stepwise multiple regression. I want to pause and make sure we understand the mechanics of that tool.
Sure, it's important.
Essentially, stepwise multiple regression is a statistical filter. It takes all the noise, all the possible variables that might be causing the jealousy, and mathematically eliminates them one by one based on their predictive power until only the true load-bearing pillars of the emotion remain.
That is an excellent way to conceptualize it. The algorithm identifies which specific variables carry the actual weight of the outcome.
And the results for study 1, when participants were observing and evaluating someone else's hypothetical relationship, it produced a perfectly logical, blended model.
It did. The regression analysis revealed that the participants attributed Chad's jealousy to a combination of both the external threat and his own internal emotional state.
So the threat of Anthony was a massive predictor, but Chad's internal variables were right there alongside it.
Right. The correlation coefficients are striking here. The statistical link between Chad's perceived need for Victoria and his resulting jealousy was 0.58.
0.58.
And the correlation between his want and his jealousy was 0.60.
Which, in psychological research, those are incredibly robust correlations.
Very robust.
It demonstrates that when we evaluate another person's romantic panic, we inherently understand the augmented duplex theory. We acknowledge that Chad is suffering not just because Anthony is a threat, but because Chad's internal architecture, his profound need and desire for his wife, makes him totally vulnerable to that threat.
It is a balanced, holistic assessment of the situation.
It makes sense.
Right.
But then, the researchers conducted study 2. And this is where the empirical data exposes a terrifying flaw in our cognitive processing.
The authors of the study themselves described the data shift in study 2 as stunning.
Because in study 2, they recruited 132 students. But they fundamentally altered the parameters. They completely removed the hypothetical Chad and Victoria.
They brought it home.
Instead, they asked the participants to interrogate their own autobiographical memories. They were instructed to recall a specific, real-life instance where they experienced profound jealousy, a moment they genuinely feared losing their partner to a rival.
And they were then subjected to the exact same rigorous questionnaire.
Right, they had to quantify their own internal variables during that crisis. How much did you need your partner? How much did you want them? And they had to evaluate the external variable. How significant of a threat was the rival?
And when the stepwise multiple regression was applied to this self-reported data, the internal variables essentially evaporated.
The statistical collapse is breathtaking. Let's really look at the numbers here. Because in study 1, observing Chad, the correlation between his need and his jealousy was 0.58. In study 2, when the participants evaluated their own jealousy, the correlation for need plummeted to 0.00.
0.00. It had zero predictive statistical value.
Nothing. The correlation for their own want fell to a trivial 0.12. Their care for the partner dropped to a negative 0.02. The entire internal side of the duplex model was completely discarded by the participants.
But the external threat variable, the correlation for how much they blamed the rival, spiked to a massive 0.71.
Okay, so if we follow that logic to its conclusion, it means that when we evaluate Chad, we possess the emotional intelligence to say Chad's panic is driven by his deep, vulnerable love and need for his wife.
Exactly.
But when we experience the exact same panic, our ego violently rejects that vulnerability. We completely refuse to concede that our internal movie script is failing, or that our attachment needs are exposed.
We rewrite the narrative entirely.
Yes. We rewrite it to say, my emotional state has absolutely nothing to do with my own neediness or desperation. My reaction is a purely logical, objective response to the fact that the rival is a massive, undeniable threat.
We engineer a complete psychological detachment from our own internal motives. We externalize the entirety of the blame onto the situational geometry.
This isn't just a slight bias, this is emotional blindness.
It really is. It is a textbook manifestation of the actor-observer effect, which is a fundamental cognitive bias, first codified by Jones and Nisbet in 1971.
Let's dig into the cognitive mechanics of why the brain executes this maneuver, because the architecture of this bias is vital to understanding the Cornell data.
So, when we occupy the role of the observer, when we are safely detached and analyzing Chad, our cognitive process defaults to dispositional attribution.
Dispositional attribution.
Right. We attribute his behavior to his internal traits, his character, and his emotional state. We have no ego investment in Chad's vulnerability, so we can assess it accurately.
But when we switch roles...
However, when we transition into the role of the actor, when we are the one experiencing the emotional turbulence, dispositional attribution becomes psychologically dangerous.
Because to admit that my jealousy is driven by my own internal need or an anxious attachment style requires me to confront my own fundamental inadequacies.
Precisely. It threatens the ego's structural integrity. So to protect itself, the brain shifts entirely to situational attribution. It creates a defensive illusion.
It is vastly more comfortable and protective of our self-esteem to point an accusatory finger at the rival and declare them the sole catalyst of the crisis.
Exactly. It allows us to frame our irrational behavior as a perfectly rational defense against an external aggressor.
So we grant ourselves a comprehensive structural pardon while holding everyone else to the fire of the full duplex theory.
Yes, that's perfectly stated.
But a critical question remains. Does this ego-protecting illusion hold up when the emotional geometry shifts from retention to acquisition? Like, what about envy?
Right. Let's transition to studies 3 and 4, which abandon the jealousy triangle and focus entirely on the mechanics of envy.
So the researchers replicated the methodology of the first two studies, but swapped the core dynamic. The focus shifted to the potential romantic partner, or PRP.
In study 3, the vignettes return, but the narrative is inverted. Now, the scenario focuses on Anthony experiencing profound envy because he desires Victoria, who is currently attached to Chad.
So the participants are once again placed in the observer role, rating Anthony's internal want, his need, his deservingness, and the external obstacle Chad represents.
And the data from study 3 perfectly mirrored the baseline established in study 1. When functioning as observers, the participants easily identified the blended model.
They attributed Anthony's envy heavily to his internal disposition.
Right. The statistical correlation for Anthony's need driving his envy was 0.58, and his want was 0.54.
So the observers clearly see that Anthony is envious because he possesses a deep internal deficit that he believes Victoria will fill.
But then, study 4 forces the participants back into the actor role.
Yeah, the real test.
They're asked to dissect their own autobiographical experiences of intense, unrequited envy, a moment They desperately desired someone occupying another relationship.
And the actor-observer illusion activates with ruthless efficiency.
Just exactly the same.
The internal variables are once again jettisoned. When evaluating their own envy, the participants claim their internal need had almost no bearing on their emotional state, dropping the correlation to 0.05.
0.05.
And their internal want dropped to 0.15.
They systematically denied their own desperation, insisting instead that their envy was almost exclusively a reaction to the external reality of the rival blocking their path.
And the external threat correlation maintained its dominance at 0.52.
It is a staggering replication of the blind spot. But within the envy data, the researchers highlighted a mechanism that complicates this picture.
The cognitive brakes.
Yes, a set of cognitive brakes they refer to as suppressor variables. We briefly touched on this with Bob's story at the very beginning, but how do these variables actually function within the statistical model?
A suppressor variable in this context is a cognitive realization that fundamentally alters the emotional output, regardless of the intensity of the want or the threat. It acts as an override code.
Exactly.
And the two primary suppressors identified in the research are relationship plausibility and feelings of deservingness.
Let's map out the plausibility override first. Imagine the internal want and need are absolutely maxed out, and the rival's threat level is monumental. Based on the model, that should generate catastrophic levels of envy.
It absolutely should, but the cognitive apparatus is constantly running reality checks.
Right.
If the potential romantic partner is a globally recognized celebrity, or resides on a different continent, or has explicitly and repeatedly stated they harbor zero romantic interest, the brain's plausibility metric registers as 0.
And that lack of plausibility suppresses the emotional output. It prevents the malicious envy from forming. You don't spend your evenings plotting the demise of movie star's spouse because your cognitive software recognizes that the geometric structure of the triangle is a localized fantasy, not a real-world threat.
The system recognizes the futility of an aggressive posture, and the same suppressive effect occurs regarding deservingness and fair treatment.
Yes.
If you objectively evaluate your standing and conclude that you do not actually deserve the potential partner, perhaps due to a massive disparity in life stages or values, or if the potential partner treats you with firm, unequivocal, platonic fairness,
the malicious destructive element of the envy is totally neutralized.
the castle siege is called off. You might still be standing in the mud, acutely aware of the warmth inside, but the cognitive override prevents you from launching the attack. You just accept the reality of the geometry.
The suppressors are really the only things preventing our thwarted desires from turning every unrequited crush into a malicious campaign.
Okay, but understanding how the actor-observer effect interacts with these suppressors leads to a truly unsettling realization. I want to push on the implications of this illusion for a second.
Sure, go ahead.
If my brain automatically obfuscates my internal want and need and convinces me that my envy is purely a reaction to the rival standing in my way, doesn't that fundamentally compromise my ability to evaluate whether I actually want the potential partner in the first place?
That is the most profound implication hidden within the data.
Because if my ego is constantly telling me, you aren't needy, you're just reacting to the fact that this other person is beating you. It seems entirely possible that I could spend months or even years obsessively chasing a relationship, not because I possess any genuine love or structural compatibility with the target, but simply because my biological competitive drive has been hijacked.
Right.
I am mistaking the primal urge to defeat a rival for authentic romantic desire.
You are describing the exact danger of allowing the actor-observer illusion to operate unchecked. Because these emotional states are deeply blended constructs, fusing ancient evolutionary alarm systems with complex, often flawed narrative scripts, we are highly susceptible to misinterpreting our own motives.
So we are essentially lying to ourselves.
The data suggests we are terrifyingly unreliable narrators of our own romantic lives.
Which means the only defense against this is aggressive self-interrogation.
We have to consciously, forcefully step out of the actor role and assume the observer perspective regarding our own behavior. We naturally accept the suppressive reality of a movie star being unattainable. We must apply that same analytical rigor to our everyday interactions.
So when the panic spikes because a partner interacts with a barista, we must pause the reaction and interrogate the software.
Exactly. Is this barista an objective threat to the structural integrity of my relationship? Or is my internal police story script misfiring?
Am I genuinely desiring this unavailable person, or am I utilizing them as a prop to satisfy malicious urge to conquer a rival?
We have to force ourselves to look at the internal correlations, those zeroed-out numbers in Study 2 and 4 that our ego is desperately trying to hide from us. We have to admit our own vulnerabilities to prevent them from dictating our behavior.
It requires an immense amount of cognitive discipline to bypass the ego's defense mechanism.
It really does.
Let's bring this entire theoretical framework back to where we started. Let's look at 16-year-old Bob sitting in biology class, but through the lens of Sternberg's augmented duplex theory and the Cornell data.
His situation maps onto the empirical findings with remarkable precision.
Bob possessed incredibly high internal variables. His want, his need, and his care for Jane were operating at maximum capacity. The external threat, John the soccer captain, was a massive, undeniable obstacle. The raw ingredients for highly destructive, malicious envy were all present on the board.
But the structural integrity of the real world intervened. The suppressor variables engaged exactly as the model predicts.
His own acute awareness of his social standing, his failure to make the team shock, it triggered the deservingness suppressor. He concluded he did not deserve the victory.
Right.
Furthermore, Jane's complete lack of interest triggered the plausibility suppressor. The cognitive brakes clamped down hard. The system functioned correctly.
It was undoubtedly an agonizing phenomenological experience for Bob, but the software correctly assessed the futility of the geometry and prevented him from launching a doomed, malicious siege against the castle.
He remained the tragic observer of his own unrequited narrative rather than becoming the villain of someone else's.
Exactly.
So, to you listening right now, the next time you feel that sudden, agonizing physiological drop in your stomach,
We all know the feeling.
the next time the urge to demand access to your partner's phone becomes overwhelming, or you find yourself obsessively analyzing the social media footprint of your crush's new significant other, I want you to remember the actor-observer effect.
Force a pause.
Yes, force a pause in the cognitive sequence. Ask yourself the difficult questions. Is this rival actually a mathematically genuine threat to your life? Or are your unacknowledged attachment needs, your ancient evolutionary hardware, and your poorly written internal movie scripts hijacking the narrative?
Right.
Are you the blind actor blaming the stage design, or can you find the discipline to step back and become the objective observer of your own mind?
And as we close this analysis, I want to leave you with one final structural implication to consider a scenario that pushes beyond the boundaries of the Cornell studies.
Okay, what is it?
If, as the data heavily suggests, our perception of our own intense jealousy or envy is largely an ego-protecting illusion that hyper-focuses on the external rival to mask our internal deficits, what is the psychological result of total victory? If you successfully launch the siege, eliminate the rival, and acquire the partner, does the intense emotional fire actually survive the transition? Or do you wake up the next morning, look at the prize you finally won, and realize with absolute dread that the profound, consuming passion you felt wasn't love at all, but merely the panic of competition, successfully disguised as romance?